Donald Trump sits alone in his private quarters in Florida, phone in hand, eyes locked not on Washington but on screens showing Asian markets opening hours ahead of the United States, because in early January 2026, the real battlefield is no longer Capitol Hill, it is the global financial system, and what he sees immediately triggers alarm. South Korean markets are climbing fast, too fast, moving in a direction that does not reflect fear, submission, or hesitation, but confidence, defiance, and something far more dangerous to American leverage. Seoul's National Assembly still has not ratified the massive $350 billion agreement that was ceremonially announced months earlier, and from Trump's perspective, this is not delay, it is betrayal. His advisors are asleep, his inner circle unreachable, cabinet secretaries hours away from responding. But Trump does not wait for process, he never has. And in the opening days of January 2026, he goes public, issuing a blunt accusation that South Korea's legislature is not living up to its deal, followed immediately by an escalation. Tariffs raised sharply from 15% to 25%, a move designed not merely to pressure but to humiliate, to punish, to remind an ally who still believes it controls the system. The shock hits Seoul hard. Emergency cabinet meetings are called. Trade and industry ministers are dispatched toward Washington, and for a brief moment, markets react with visible stress. Headlines flash panic, commentators speak of rupture, and analysts repeat the familiar script of American economic dominance. But here is where the story breaks from expectation, because almost no one notices what is happening elsewhere, while cameras remain fixed on Korea. Thousands of miles away, in New Delhi and Brussels, doors are closed, documents are finalized, and signatures are placed on agreements that will permanently alter the balance of power. And by the time Washington realizes what has happened, the architecture is already built. What unfolds over the next 36 hours in early January 2026 will be studied for decades as the moment America's allies stopped asking for permission and started building systems designed to function without Washington at the center. This is not a trade dispute. This is not retaliation. This is a coordinated flanking maneuver that took more than a year to prepare, executed precisely when American attention was focused on the wrong battlefield. And if you are already sensing that something does not add up, pause right here and ask yourself, is this really about tariffs, or are we watching the collapse of a post-war order in real time? Days earlier, also in early January 2026, the U.S. Treasury Secretary appeared on national television and made a statement that passed unnoticed by most viewers but rang alarm bells inside financial circles. He acknowledged openly that India had been hit with punitive tariffs for purchasing Russian energy, and then casually added that Europe had just signed a major trade agreement with India anyway. That was not analysis. It was a warning. It was a signal that Washington understood something was slipping out of its control. Yet 48 hours later, the tariff threat against South Korea still goes out, as if leverage remains unquestioned. The markets respond with a verdict that should terrify any strategist. After an initial dip, South Korean stocks surge and close at an all-time high. Tens of billions of dollars in market capitalization swing upward in a single session. Investors are not afraid. They are betting against American pressure. They are betting that Seoul will not fold, that Washington's threats no longer carry the same weight, and that global capital has alternatives. Markets are not ideological, they are mathematical, and their message in early January 2026 is brutally clear: coercion is losing effectiveness. At the same time, Europe and India announce what can only be described as the mother of all trade agreements, a free trade framework creating a 2 billion-person economic zone with a combined GDP approaching $27 trillion, nearly a quarter of humanity and global economic output. Negotiations that stalled for years suddenly conclude with astonishing speed. This was not diplomacy finding momentum. This was panic acceleration. Europe was hedging against an unpredictable United States, and India was positioning itself as the central node of a new economic order. Now stop here and answer this honestly. Do you believe it is a coincidence that this deal was finalized precisely as Washington escalated threats against another ally? Or do you see coordination, timing, and intent? Because once you trace the energy flows and financial structures beneath the surface, the picture becomes impossible to ignore. Quietly, almost invisibly, also in early January 2026, Russia and India sign a long-term energy agreement worth tens of billions of dollars. Discounted Russian fuel flows east, refined in India, and re-enters European markets as legally compliant products. No sanctions are technically violated, yet the entire sanctions regime is undermined. The United States attempted to isolate Russia, and instead helped create a durable arbitrage system that bypasses American control entirely. Russia gains customers, India gains cheap energy and profit margins, Europe gains energy without political exposure, and Washington gains nothing but the illusion of enforcement. This is the point at which hostility between global blocs stops being rhetorical and hardens into something far more dangerous and structurally irreversible. The United States did not simply pressure its allies through tariffs, sanctions, and public ultimatums, it unintentionally forced them into alignment with one another. By attempting to discipline individual partners in isolation, Washington created the exact conditions that made collective resistance both rational and necessary. Europe, India, and Russia now operate within a functional, self-reinforcing triangle that bypasses the US dollar, bypasses American political approval, and bypasses the enforcement mechanisms that once gave Washington decisive leverage. This structure generates massive annual trade and energy flows that the United States cannot meaningfully sanction, cannot effectively tax, and cannot easily disrupt without escalating into open economic warfare. What was once a fragmented set of bilateral relationships has quietly evolved into an integrated system designed to survive American pressure rather than comply with it. If this realization is landing with you now, pause for a moment and reflect on how often you have been told that sanctions are working, that pressure is isolating adversaries, and that compliance is inevitable, while the underlying data tells a very different story. Instead of contraction, we see rerouting. Instead of isolation, we see laundering of trade through intermediaries. Instead of economic suffocation, we see expansion through alternative channels that grow more sophisticated with each new round of restrictions. And the deeper question is no longer about individual sanctions or isolated trade disputes. The real question is this: if America's allies are actively constructing parallel systems that function without the United States at their center, what does leadership actually mean in this new environment? And how much authority remains when compliance is no longer required for survival? Meanwhile, China watches quietly from the sidelines and benefits enormously from the disorder it did not have to create. While Washington expends political capital fighting with its own allies, Beijing tightens its grip on strategic choke points, restricting rare earth exports, expanding control over processing capacity, and deepening supply chain dependencies that are nearly impossible to unwind quickly. At the same time, China increases semiconductor imports from South Korea, absorbs production that is displaced by Western trade friction, and steadily expands yuan-denominated trade across Asia, Africa, and parts of Europe. Beijing does not need to fracture the Western alliance directly, it simply allows American pressure to do the work for it. As a result, the dollar's share of global reserves continues its long, steady decline, tariff levels climb to heights not seen since the Great Depression era, and the global system drifts closer to a tipping point that most political leaders understand privately, but refuse to acknowledge publicly. This is not a sudden collapse. It is a slow, measurable shift in gravity, and once it passes a certain threshold, it becomes extraordinarily difficult to reverse. This is no longer abstract geopolitics discussed in think tank rooms or buried in policy memos. It is visible, measurable, and increasingly unavoidable in everyday economics. As U.S. leverage declines, the cost of capital rises, and when the cost of capital rises, everything downstream starts to tighten. Borrowing becomes more expensive for the government, for businesses, and ultimately for households. Inflation pressures intensify not because of a single headline event, but because the system begins to lose the hidden discount that reserve currency dominance once provided. Purchasing power erodes quietly, then all at once, as prices respond to higher financing costs, weakened bargaining power, and growing uncertainty. The most uncomfortable part is that many of the policies being sold to the public as protection, strength, and getting tough are accelerating vulnerability instead. Every new tariff threat pushes partners to explore alternatives that reduce exposure to U.S. pressure. Every sanction incentivizes a workaround industry that gets smarter with every round of restrictions. Every public ultimatum delivered as a display of authority becomes a tutorial for allies on how to survive without Washington's approval, and once survival is proven possible, dependence becomes optional. South Korea now finds itself trapped in a strategic vice, and it is one of the clearest case studies of what happens when the middle ground begins to disappear. Militarily, Seoul remains deeply dependent on the United States for deterrence in a region defined by North Korean instability and broader great power competition. Economically, however, South Korea is intertwined with China through trade, manufacturing supply chains, and export demand that cannot be replaced quickly without enormous cost. Politically, the country is constrained at home by legislative dynamics, public sentiment, and the simple reality that national pride hardens under pressure, especially when outside demands look like humiliation. That is why the response becomes so volatile. Markets can celebrate defiance, pricing in a belief that Washington will blink or compromise, while the legislature resists pressure precisely because it does not want to appear coerced. South Korea is being forced to balance security dependence on one side and economic dependence on the other. And as the global environment becomes more polarized, that balancing act becomes less stable, less credible, and more punishing. Zoom out further and the historical pattern becomes undeniable because this is not a single incident, it is an accelerating sequence. In 1971, the gold window closed and a foundational monetary assumption was broken without warning to allies. In 2003, Iraq fractured alliances and exposed deep limits to transatlantic unity. In the late 2010s, major multilateral agreements were weakened or abandoned, reinforcing the idea that commitments were conditional and transactional rather than durable. Now, in early January 2026, another cut is added, sharper and deeper, and the pace is the most alarming part. Each rupture happens faster than the one before it, and each rupture lowers the threshold for the next one, because trust does not simply recover on its own. Once partners learn to hedge, they keep hedging. Once they build alternative routes, they keep using them. Once they prove they can function outside the old system stops being the default. And now this becomes personal, because the consequences do not remain on trading floors or in diplomatic communiques. If this trajectory continues, inflation does not care about party loyalty. Interest rates do not negotiate. Purchasing power does not wait for elections or slogans or talking points. Households feel the shift through higher monthly payments, higher insurance, higher food costs, higher energy costs, and tighter credit. Businesses feel it through higher financing costs and more fragile supply chains. Governments feel it through rising debt service burdens that squeeze budgets and reduce room for maneuver. The scenarios ahead range from slow decline to sudden rupture, and each one carries severe consequences for savings, mortgages, and the practical cost of daily life. So here is the question you need to answer for yourself right now, not as ideology, but as risk assessment. Which path feels more likely in the world you're watching today? Slow erosion that grinds down purchasing power over years, a sudden shock that reprices everything over months, or an unlikely managed transition that requires cooperation precisely when major powers are choosing confrontation. As January 2026 unfolds, several key moments loom that will reveal whether this shift is consolidating or fragmenting. Legislative battles in Seoul will show whether domestic politics can absorb external pressure without backlash. Finance ministers meeting in Europe will reveal whether coordination is real or merely rhetorical. Ratification fights, public signaling, and behind-the-scenes bargaining will determine whether new economic alignments hold steady or crack under internal division. And beneath all of it lies a truth that no speech can erase and no social media post can reverse. Power is shifting not by declaration but by design, not by ideology but by incentives, not by a single dramatic collapse, but by repeated decisions that teach nations how to hedge, how to reroute, and how to operate without a single center of gravity. What began as a public tariff threat has exposed something far larger than a dispute over percentages. It has revealed the moment America's allies stopped asking and started acting. That is the real headline. And it is the part most people miss because it unfolds quietly in signatures, in settlement mechanisms, in supply chains, and in capital flows. If this has changed how you see the trade war narrative, if you now suspect this is not deal-making but blowback, then say it. Drop your view clearly. Does South Korea ultimately fold under pressure, or does it resist and force a face-saving compromise? And who benefits most from this realignment, China, India, or Europe? And why? Because empires rarely fall in a single collapse. They erode through accumulated miscalculations. Early January 2026 may be remembered as one of those inflection points when markets shrugged, allies hedged, and leverage slipped. If you want to understand where this goes next, stay engaged because the real game is no longer being played where most people are looking. And now you know.